I admire John Mearsheimer, but I think he is wrong. Not necessarily in his judgments about events like Gaza or Ukraine. In many ways, that's what I admire about him. He has stood courageously for a different assessment of those events, despite a lot of criticism. But I think he is wrong in his model of world history and great power relationships. And like most creative, original minds, Mearsheimer is wrong in interesting ways that we can all learn from.
What's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked.
If we look into why he's wrong, we can improve our own judgment about world events. And it's especially important to do so since John Mearsheimer is the lead representative, I guess, of a school of realism about politics and international affairs that is often presented as the contrast to liberalism or neoconservatism and the current aggressive foreign policy of the West. He's remarkably courageous in articulating that view of realism, but just because he says his view of the world is realist doesn't mean we need to accept it as such. And just because his realist view is more constrained than the aggressive current foreign policy of America and others should not stop us asking a few important questions about John Mearsheimer's analysis of the world. After all, he has asked himself in an important essay on the morality of events in Gaza whether those events prove his theory of realism in international relationships wrong. His prediction about the rise of China happening exactly like the rise of America doesn't seem to be happening as predicted. And way back, John Mearsheimer, in fact, wanted to place nuclear weapons on the borders of Russia in Ukraine. Just imagine how bad the world would be if that had happened. Now, I'm no international relations scholar, but like you, I am an intelligent reader and viewer of world affairs, and I am trying to think for myself and exercise some judgment to try to discern a sense of reality in the very particular events, the particular people and places that are happening. And my main argument is that John Mearsheimer bases his realism in an abstract theory, not in the specific empirical reality of real history. John Mearsheimer's work presents a theory called offensive realism. He is a distinguished scholar of international relations. He began his career in the US military, but unlike so many people in the, foreign policy elite of the United States, he's never really tried to both wield and to study power at the same time. He really is a true scholar. He emphasizes in his theory of offensive realism the aggressive nature of states and the pursuit of power. And perhaps, given he has been based in the United States of America, and the United States has been at war in all but 17 years of its existence, perhaps that emphasis on the aggressive nature of states in the pursuit of hegemony. That should not surprise us. The main books in which Mearsheimer outlines his offensive realism, I'll just quickly outline. The Tragedy of Great Power Politics is his classic book from 2001. This book is the primary book where Mearsheimer develops and elaborates on his theory of offensive realism. It argues that the inherent nature of great powers is to seek dominance, leading to conflict and competition in international politics. Mearsheimer uses historical examples to illustrate how great powers pursue expansionist strategies to secure their positions and how this drive for power influences international outcomes. His 2007 book, The Israel Lobby and the and US Foreign Policy, co-authored with Stephen Walt, is more focused on the influence of the Israel lobby on US foreign policy, and it has clearly come to more prominence over the last 6 or so months. Although not exclusively about offensive realism, this book reflects Mearsheimer's views on how states, including the United States, act in ways consistent with offensive realist principles, pursuing policies that serve their strategic interests and enhance their power. Although, as I said, in recent, over the last 12 months or so, Mearsheimer has reflected on whether the most recent real history of relations between Israel and the United States actually contradict his basic principles of offensive realism. In 2014, he published a book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? The Thucydides Trap is an idea popularized or promoted by the American scholar Graham Allison that said there's a great likelihood, a trap, that when a rising power emerges against an established power, they will end up in war, going back to the historian Thucydides. In this book, Mearsheimer examines the rising tensions between the United States and China. This was back in 2014. Tensions have got a lot worse since. Through the lens of offensive realism. He argued that as China rose and sought to challenge United States dominance, the likelihood of conflict would increase, a situation consistent with the offensive realist perspective on the inevitability of a great power conflict. And in a moment, we'll have a closer look at a video or a lecture he gave following that book that really outlined in some detail or with exceptional clarity the key assumptions of his theory. And in 2018, he published The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities, which is a very fine book. It's the main book of Mearsheimer's that I've read closely. This book really explores two key questions. What went wrong with post-Cold War US foreign policy, and how do liberalism, nationalism and realism, which Mearsheimer identifies in the book as the key ideologies of international relations, how do they affect relations among states? And he argues that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States of America found itself so powerful, the unipolar moment, that it could adopt a profoundly liberal foreign policy, commonly referred to as liberal hegemony. But that this policy was destined to fail because it was pitted against both nationalism and realism. Now, a casual reader might immediately say, is it really a true characterization of the three main ideologies of international relations to call them liberalism, nationalism, and realism? I like to put it in colloquial terms related to my own experience as a bureaucrat. You used to always present three options. Option A, the really bad option. Option B, the really utopian option. And option C, the realistic option. In a way, I think perhaps one should start to think about whether what Mearsheimer calls realism is really just a, let's say, a flattering term. It's self-described realism. I'm realistic, you're a fantasist, and they are off their rocker. Realism is, we need to explore what really is meant by realism. And what Mearsheimer really means by his idea of offensive realism is an idea that states, governments, nations, states are fundamentally driven by the desire for power and dominance in an anarchic international system, leading to inevitable conflict and competition, especially among great powers. So it is a theory about behaviour, a set of assumptions about behaviour that is described realism. But given the name realism, to create the impression that I know what the real world is like. You are indulging in silly fantasies about it. And as I mentioned before, about 10 years ago, John Mearsheimer did a public lecture on the theme of Can China Rise Peacefully? That was based upon his book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? In this video, which I have a link in the description below for if you want to check it out, he really articulates very clearly his theory of realism, his theory of international relations, and it really helps us ask the question, as he sets these ideas out so simply and clearly, ask the question, if we think for ourselves, if we exercise our own judgment, if we test it against our own sense of reality, of the world we live in right here, right now, whether Mearsheimer is wrong. He does really three things in this video. He sets out his theory of international relations, commenting that no one can predict the future. There are no facts about the future, so that if you there's no one who's an expert on the future, so that if you want to answer the questions about the future, you need a theory. Now, that in itself is perhaps a big assumption, but that is why he sets out his theory of international relations, and it says a lot about Mearsheimer's thought process, its logical clarity and theoretical. He also presents a brief overview history of US foreign policy that aims to show that the US behave according to the principles or the assumptions of John Mearsheimer's realism theory of international relations. And thirdly, he makes the prediction that based on his theory, China will likely behave just as the United States has demonstrated it has behaved in its history. And that means that conflict is coming. So I think if we look carefully at the assumptions that he sets out, we can really start to answer the question ourselves, or ask ourselves the question, is Mearsheimer wrong? So in his theory of international relations, he says there are 5 assumptions. The first assumption is that states are the principal actors in international relations, and they act within an anarchic system. Now, it's interesting that he uses the term anarchy. He says anarchy is the opposite of hierarchy. He says if there is no single boss of the international relations system, it is therefore in anarchy. Now, it's interesting because that's not quite what my understanding of what anarchy is. My sense of anarchy means there's no order, there's no rule, there's no customs, there's no shared constraints, there's no civility between states. Whereas John Mearsheimer says merely if there's not one person or one state that sets the rules for all the others, it is anarchy. I think this is a fundamental weakness in his theory. But that's assumption 1. States are principal actors in an anarchic system. He also says all states have some capability for offensive military action. Of course, Mearsheimer began his life in the US military. His study of international relations is largely serving military strategy, I guess, as much as anything. And this is a key thing. Basically, all states have some level of capacity for organised violence against other states and in an anarchic system. And then thirdly, he says this is fundamentally crucial to his theory, states can never be sure of the intentions of other states, especially their future intentions. Now, so he says, he says, we don't know if tomorrow the country that neighbours us is going to war against us. And at some level, of course, this is obviously true. No one knows the future intentions of others. But I wonder also whether he rather overstates this. He turns it into an axiom of complete blindness, that perhaps a blindness to likely outcomes, that works with a simplified model of international relations, can reduce it to a more simple strategic game. But I don't know if it's really valid. And then the fourth assumption that he makes is that the principal goal of states is to survive. He says it's not the only goal, but it is the primary goal, the one goal that drives all the others, and that one can then just, for analytical purposes, ignore all the others and fundamentally say, if we're going to assess their national interest, what is their main national interest in survival? Again, one wonders whether this is really an empirically valid assessment of how states have actually behaved in history, how much a mere goal of survival drives and structures all the other influences on a complex state's actions. And then finally, fifthly, his fifth assumption is that states are rational actors. They are strategic calculators. Now, this is an interesting assumption in itself, which has a number of embedded assumptions in it. States are actors, are rational actors, and that means they are single actors as well. They're not divided states, despite all the evidence before us every day that every government in the world is composed of competing agencies and factions and different interests and multiple motivations, some of which do not necessarily all cohere together. He also says they are rational actors. Rational means, presumably, they agree with all the above assumptions that that John Mearsheimer has made, particularly that the one overriding rational factor is to assess the likelihood of survival against other aggressive states who they cannot understand. So these five assumptions, which as we can see, you can question quite significantly, these five assumptions are fundamental to his theory of realism, and his argument is that these assumptions work together to drive certain types of behaviour in the international relations system. Certain types of behaviour that a realist appreciates that others don't really appreciate. The first type of behaviour, he says, is these factors, these assumptions, these realities of the international relations system create fear. You don't know other states' intentions, and it's anarchical and there's no constraints, no governing authority over any other state. And the second behaviour these assumptions drive is, he says, it's a self-help system, and it means that it defines the goal of great powers to be to maximise the relative power, to be the biggest guy on the block. These are the terms he uses. The name of the game is to be extremely powerful, or in the word that you've almost certainly heard of, to be the hegemon. Now, after having all these theoretical assumptions about how the world works and what it drives people to do, he then adds in his little note of realism. He says, because he is a realist, he believes that no country can be a global hegemon. Now, that's a very limited way of defining what a realistic assessment of the world should be. That unless if you don't believe in world domination, you're a realist. This is what he argues. But he argues because no country can be a global hegemon, the best any state can do is to be a regional hegemon. And what's more, he says there has actually only ever been one real regional hegemon, and that is the United States. So suddenly we're introduced to a little bit of history in his realistic theory of international relations, and we find that his whole theory of international relations is based on an assumption about how great powers interact that has only ever been true of one country in the world, and that is the United States of America, for the last, say, 200 years. And so one would have to ask oneself, is this realist theory really based on real history? What about the behaviour of all the other states of the world? Can we really transpose what the United States has chosen in its history to do with the theoretical possibilities of what all the other countries in the world have never aimed to do, never tried to do, never been able to do? And he relates this also to the second goal of international relations, which is that to ensure there is no regional competitor who dominates, so that you have the freedom to roam in others' backyards. You don't want other states to roam in yours. So this is what makes it offensive realism. It's not just saying, well, we can't be a global hegemon and why don't we stick to our own world? We have to be a dominant person in our region so that we can project power and roam freely across the rest of the world. Again, it is a theory based on the unique history of the United States of America, a very contingent history which is never going to repeat itself in the same way again, which is now past, but which John Mearsheimer has embedded into his theory of realism of international relations. So let me just summarise then about what the main ways I see that John Mearsheimer is wrong. First of all, let's go back to that whole assumption about how he sees the international world right from the start. It confuses the opposite of, well, I guess, a monarchy in international relations, what he calls hierarchy in international relations, with anarchy in international relations. And I think this is a fundamental mistake because it doesn't accept that there are constraints on actors in the world that are agreed and shared amongst them, even though there is no one single state that is the boss. Secondly, I think he's wrong about the motivations of states. They are not just aggressive seekers of dominance, aggressive seekers of survival, in a dog-eat-dog world. They are culturally formed. They have all sorts of different motivations and ways of acting. And I think the history of the world provides abundant proof of that. And I think the history of the emerging multipolar world, if you like, is also showing that. India, China, Russia, the BRIC states, even in ways the European Union, are not articulating a view about the world that is the same as the struggle for, global or regional hegemony from the United States of America. Thirdly, I think he makes a mistake about the rationality of states. States certainly have people who make rational calculations, strategic calculators amongst them. But states are extremely divided. The history of World War I, in a wonderful book by Christopher Clark, Sleepwalkers, how Europe went to war in 1914, makes this point brilliantly. All those different states had factions, they were divided executives. They had people arguing one way and arguing in another way, pulling to war, pulling to peace. And those ideas are often powerful ideas, emotional ideas, ideas about identity, not necessarily rational strategic calculations. The fourth mistake I think John Mearsheimer makes is he reduces politics to a kind of simplified game theory. That's what his 5 assumptions really does. Game theory is a way of understanding economics and human behaviour by turning it into Agent 1 and Agent 2, who are engaged in a game that has certain win-lose conditions. And effectively what John Mearsheimer's assumptions does is he constructs international relations as a form of a game. The agents are the great powers because anyone else other than the great powers, and particularly anyone else other than the hegemon and the challenger, are largely sort of rubbed out of his discussion. And they act against certain principles, that they're rational, that their main interest is the struggle of survival, and within certain game conditions, which is they do not know what the others intend, but except for the fact that they all have a capacity to hurt each other. It's like prisoner's dilemma applied to international relations. Again, I think this is a productive and creative and imaginative way of clarifying and a logical way of thinking about international relations, a way that for thinking about international relations that no doubt has a lot of value in calculating what people might do in a high-risk situation. But I think it also profoundly misunderstands the complexity of human world history. And then the fifth error, I think, that he makes is that he assumes all world orders, all international relations systems follow the experience, the singular historical experience of one unique, exceptional state, the United States of America. In other words, his realism is not realistic. It's not grounded in real history. It's grounded in simplified assumptions about reality that are analytically powerful, that in some circumstances do predict events, as any model will do, but simply does not give you a full sense of the reality across all the different circumstances that we will encounter in our lifetime. And I think there is a real tragedy in his realism. He defines the offensive realistic goals of foreign policy based on the singular experience of the United States, an experience that is never ever going to be repeated again. And that is not based on a reasonable appreciation of the real world of history. He locks international relations into the limited assumptions of his oversimplified game and into the aggressive history of the regional hegemon of the United States. He does not allow people to imagine alternative futures of world history, of international relations that are not based on the stark assumptions of offensive realism. Don't get me wrong, there is so much I do appreciate about John Mearsheimer's work. Many of the alternative theories of international relations, like dreamy liberalism or extreme nationalism, are equally erroneous. And it is certainly better for foreign policy to be focused a little bit on restraint rather than an assumption that a country like the United States can do anything it wants. But I think if we really want, as John Mearsheimer urges in his book the Great Delusion, to learn from the mistakes of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, we should look for a sense of reality and not a theory of realism, especially not offensive realism. I'm offering you this not as a last word. Of course, I am a mere YouTuber on history with a bit of real life experience in government, I've got to admit, and, pretty widely read. And I certainly could not match John Mearsheimer in a detailed scholarly argument about international relations. But I do think it is an invitation to you to question even the most esteemed speakers on world affairs and world events, wherever you might encounter them, in the mainstream media or in independent media, and to ask some good questions about what is confidently projected as realistic, as sensible, as the right thing to do, and to try to read events, world events, in an intelligent, specific, historically grounded way. We all, at the moment, tend to rely on fragmented voices, and I think it's important to seek out alternative views and test them with your own sense of reality. I talk about that a little bit in this video, which is reading Isaiah Berlin's great essay on political judgment that you might want to check out, and which you can also listen to on my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com.